Hi, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. I'm really excited and honored to be sitting here again with one Andrew Root. Andy, you prefer Andy, right? Yeah, he is.
Yeah.
He is waving from Hawaii. He graciously setting aside an hour of vacation in the Hawaii sun to talk to me about Severance and his book. So thanks, Andy, for doing that. Um,
Yeah.
well, yeah, I thought of you. I was reading your brand new book, which my review just posted. If you haven't seen my review, I'll probably link to that below too. But Evangelism in an Age of Despair is it's a fantastic book, and I just finished it. Was just putting my thoughts together for the review, and I'm also a huge fan of Severance. And I remembered from our previous conversations, you mentioned you're a huge pop culture person. So I thought maybe these threads could come together because there really are, and this is not me, I don't think this is me shoehorning things together, hopefully not. But I do think there are real themes in your work, and especially in this
Mm.
last book, that really were, because I was reading it while I was watching season two, it just was all kind of resonating together. No pun intended on the use of resonance, but um, I was just thinking that it would be really fun to sit down and talk through some of that stuff. So my goal for this next hour is to talk about some of the themes in the book. I do want to point people to the book and then get into Severance, kind of as a window on our cultural moment and back onto some of the things you're talking about. So before we get to the show, though, um, there's so many themes in your book that we could start with. I had a hard time picking one, but I thought maybe it would be good to just first start with the idea of the self. So I don't know if you want to say any introductory comments before we talk about that, but I'll just throw out the question of how in the world do you define the self? What are some misconceptions we have about that in our culture? And let's start there and then see where we can go from that.
Yeah, well, yeah, as you know, Joel, I mean that's a huge question that
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean particularly I think at the end of the 20th century was really picked up. I mean, Charles Taylor is someone who I've done a lot of work with, and he wrote a huge book. I guess maybe in Taylor lore it's not that huge. It's only like 450 pages, but called Sources of the Self was trying to articulate what it means to be a self, or how did we get to this point where the self is nearly sacred in
Mm,
late modernity? And it really does go back to Augustine in some ways, and this idea where God meets us is in some ways like in the heart, in kind of the internal constitution, that God meets us in the still small voice, in
right.
some ways. But there has been a long kind of architecture, if you will, a long construction of turning us to be quite self-obsessed people, I think, and creating things like psychology and all sorts of kind of realities like that. So, I mean, one way I would think about it kind of phenomenologically within the modern project, is that it's been a drive, at least in the 20th century or late 19th century on, has had this sense of it's an inwardness.
Mm-hmm.
That what the self is this kind of inward feel of who you are. So it becomes very interconnected with your identity. So like how you would answer the question, "Who am I?" tends to have a sense of like how you understand yourself and what it means
Mm,
to be a self. In this book,
mm.
that where I mean, I try to touch on that quite a bit in the
The
mysticism
previous one,
book.
right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Whatever that book was called. The
Secular
Church in the
mysticisms.
the Church in the Age of Secular Mysticisms or something like that.
Got it
Well, look at
right
that.
here.
We've yeah, you're
I,
a
I moved my
prepared
yeah,
guy.
I moved my camera over so I could try to get those
Right,
down in the
right. Yeah,
corner.
yeah. You do that for every interview you
That's
do.
right.
Yeah. But yeah, I tried to kind of look at it in that book, but then in this evangelism book, particularly looked at this French thinker named Montaigne, Michel de Montaigne, and he I think one of the big moves for him that leads us to be quite obsessed with the self, and I think connects to Severance here, is Montaigne for the most part. I mean, this is an overstatement in a bit, but is kind of the inventor of happiness. Or
Hmm.
that what you should do, the way to live and to live well is to live in this kind of happy disposition, that's like the highest good. So like Montaigne left the court of the French court and kind of escaped to his chateau and just wanted to, he wrote essays. That's how we know him so well. He was like the inventor of the essay. So if you wrote an essay in your sophomore year of college, or throughout your college career, you
Yeah.
can curse Montaigne's name for inventing that. But really, it was this kind of pursuit of the. I guess it's the same reason why undergrads write essays. It's kind of an inner test. Like, what do
Mm-hmm.
you know? What can you
Mm.
know? And Montaigne's often also called kind of the father of skepticism because he realizes as he interrogates himself in a kind of conversation and tests himself with the essay, he realizes he doesn't really know much. All he
Mm.
really ultimately knows is that he's a self and that he is on this chateau and he wants to live in a way that he can really enjoy the pleasures of a kind of nonchalant lifestyle. You know, like
Right.
he says things like he just wants to garden, and when he's gardening, really garden, and when he's sleeping, really sleep, and when he's petting his cat, really pet his cat. So
Mm-hmm.
there's this sense, I think, that kind of supercharges our conceptions of the self and the internal, that I'm trying to be happy, that there's a way that I kind of feel for myself, if that even makes sense. We're kind of being redundant in some ways, but I know myself
Yeah,
by
yeah.
feeling internally the kind of shape of myself and who I really am and what I really want. And so there's something really subjective about it, but there's also something really emotive about it. But we also hold that there's something like kind of core about it in some ways, but then
Mm-hmm.
is there, like where's
Mm-hmm.
consciousness in the self? Where isn't? Where's the body and where's the self?
Yeah.
Like these things all really come up in the TV show as well,
Yes.
So are we really, when we have Mark, is Mark two selves or is he one
Right.
self? He's one body, but there's two kind of, a divided consciousness there.
Mm-hmm.
How does
Mm-hmm.
that, like those become big questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Oh man, so many things we could dive into there. I want to, because I think this idea of the self, I think it's at the same time one of the most important things to try to understand, and possibly one of the most difficult for people, late modern people.
Hmm.
At least that's my experience of wrestling it down to the ground a bit. So can you comment just a little bit more on, like, theoretically and in generalities, how might a pre-Montaigne person or a pre-modern person have responded to the question, who are you? And
Yeah.
how does that shed some light on how we conceive of ourselves so very differently? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And it would depend on like where you were located. Say, well, we'll just stay within the medieval society. Like,
Sure.
like if you're a peasant working the land, you probably really don't ever even ask the question like, who
Right.
am I? Like, like
Yeah. Hmm.
you're just kind of told. I mean,
Hmm.
one thing you would probably say is like a worshiper of the true God or something, like,
Mm.
a taker of the host. There'd be some kind of religious way you'd probably understand that. If you
Hmm.
were a noble person or one of the landed people, you would probably think of yourself inside of a long history. Like you would think of yourself as from this house.
Right. Hmm.
You hear this like in Game of Thrones,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
here
Hmm.
it is,
Hmm.
first of his kind, da 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 da
Hmm.
da.
Hmm.
Like there would be a sense where you would know your identity through your history, and it would be very much backward looking.
Hmm.
Like this just shows you how big of a nerd I am. But like while I'm here on vacation, I'm reading a a
Oh
six
man.
volume history of England, and so
Oh wow.
I'm on volume three. But the author's really clear that particularly in like from like 1000 until basically the Reformation, there's an overwhelming sense for people that they're looking backward. That
Mm.
what has happened is we've lost some kind of golden age. Like the ancient age was a golden age, and we're trying to kind of get back there, or there's hidden knowledge back there, or certain ways of being that we've lost. And you can see
Mm.
how this kind of turn internal to the self for us moderns has something to do with our conception of time and of
Yes.
history, and that the self can even step outside of history, which, I keep making
Mm.
connections to the show, but that's one of the really
Yeah.
interesting dynamics when Mark has a conversation with himself on the,
Hmm. Hmm. The
recorder.
finale. Yeah.
Yeah, in the finale.
Spoiler alert for Severance. I should have started at the beginning. Like,
Oh
we're just going
yeah.
to talk about anything and everything that's happened in the first two seasons for anyone who's watching. But yes, he has this
Yeah.
conversation with Mark Scout and Mark S, the Audi innie. They talk back and forth on this this camcorder, and it's an awesome sequence. But anyways, that's what you're referring to.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll just keep spoiling it for people,
Yeah, yeah.
but that there's where he says like when they're getting in a debate, which is surprising in itself.
Hmm.
Mark Scout, Audi Mark is like, well, I've known this woman forever. Like in some sense, he's saying like I have a history here,
Mm,
and there
mm,
is a way he's saying like myself is more constituted and therefore kind of firmer in the
right,
world because it
right,
has a
right.
history. You don't really have a history. You've been down there, whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
couple years or 4 years, and it's great you're having feelings, but I actually
Yeah,
have a history, you know what I
right.
mean? And of course, Mark S is kind of the any Mark is like, well, I'm having an event of encounter with this woman I
Mm-hmm.
love too. And
Mm-hmm.
that shouldn't be minimized at all. And just because it isn't
Mm-hmm.
as long of a history as you have. So I think, like, back to your question, a kind of pre-modern person would have put themselves in a larger history. As
Wow.
if that makes sense. So
It does, yeah.
there's a way that one of the dynamics I'm playing with in another project too is the difference between the inward in the kind of inward space versus in interspace. And this is another Charles
Mm.
Taylor phrase. Like and he's in his latest book, he's writing on the phenomenology of poetry, and he thinks poetry is so important because it creates an interspace.
Hmm.
Kind of like Star Trek, I guess. But
Is this the
like
language animal? Is that what you're referring to?
this is the second one. This is Cosmic Connections
Oh, okay. I'm
that
not
just
familiar with
came
that.
out 24 maybe it came
Oh,
out.
wow. Okay.
Yeah. So it's like, Language Animals was the prelude to
Got it.
this thing. But he does in Language Animals, he uses the word interspace as well.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this sense, and he actually in Cosmic Connections works a lot off of and gives a lot of credit to Hartmut Rosa for this his
Hmm.
sense of resonance being in kind of an interspace where you connect, you hear a conversation. There's something that takes you out of yourself that then informs you on who yourself is. So there's a kind of this dialogue. But there's
Mm-hmm.
this whole move within, I think, modernity to make us really more concerned about inward space.
Mm.
What is my inward space? And so I think that would be a difference is that for a pre-modern person, it would all be interspace.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Interspace as the church or interspace within
Mm-hmm.
nature itself, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
but for sure within history.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's really helpful. And the allusions we're making to that conversation between Mark and Innie Mark just feels like there's so many threads to pull out of that and layers to pull out of that that relate to all these ideas. Like, and one thing that your comments brought me to, especially this tension between the inner and then the inter space, or
Hmm.
the way I understand it as being kind of how you find yourself as defined more outwardly, is also Taylor's notion of politics of recognition,
Right.
and the authenticity thing there too. That connects, seems to me to connect too with the Mark S expressing his authentic experience that he's having, and also he expresses a lot of angst about, I didn't decide, this was essentially a being that was created. Like I didn't
Yeah.
choose to be put in this position, but here I am, and I'm having this authentic experience, and it's being failed to be recognized by the Audi Mark, who's in a way having the same argument back. I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot there that is kind of opening a
Yeah.
window. Does that spark any response in you, or
Yeah,
what?
no, it
Yeah.
does. Because I mean, it really is. I haven't thought about this sense, so maybe we'll fail. Maybe our plane will crash here. But there is there like back to your point where Marquez is like I didn't choose this. I mean in
Mm-hmm.
some sense that's true for all of us.
Yes,
None
exactly.
of us
Mm-hmm.
chose to be here. Like we
Mm-hmm.
were born into this. This is I think what existential philosophers really help us with. Like
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
it's a crisis that you exist. Like you didn't get to choose this. And so in a world of like you have to give consent all the time. Well, your very existence you didn't give consent to. And is that
Mm.
gift or is that
Wow.
torture or what is that? So Mark
Mm-hmm.
S didn't give the kind of consent to that. And so that I think that's interesting in itself. Where were you were saying something else that was triggering a thought
I
in
was
me.
bringing up the politics of recognition and
Yeah.
Taylor's comments on authenticity, and Mark S's argument for, and there's also an interesting thread too in that whole. I mean, you could write a dissertation on just that scene, I think, but like
Yeah.
there's a thread too that is coming to mind for me about Mark S's learning about this whole reintegration process and what's that going to mean for like our combined self on the outside.
Right.
And I think he uses a line of something like, he says something like, am I just going to make up 20% of yourself when I'm
Oh,
reintegrated into you? Like,
right,
what is that going to mean for me and the
right.
experiences I've had? And do I even still exist at that point? So
Yeah.
there's a whole other thing that can kind of be
Yeah.
unearthed there. So
Yeah, yeah.
let's
And
throw
the
that
other
to
piece
her.
that I was gonna yeah,
Hmm.
the piece that triggered in me is that really what Mark Scout is calling him into is a very a larger story. Like so
Yeah. Hmm.
there's this interesting
Oh,
dynamic that
wow.
plays out. Like so Mark S is saying, and I think Mark S obviously is driven by his own wants, his own desires.
Hmm.
And we'll talk about how those come out of grief and things like that here, I'm
Yes.
sure.
Yeah.
But there is a sense like this brings Lumen down. Like there's a certain kind of apocalyptic eschatological story that
Yeah.
Mark Scout is calling Mark S in. But Mark S is not sure that he believes this story or that
Mm.
he wants to surrender to this larger story, particularly if it calls for self-sacrifice. I mean, that's a
Wow.
really interesting kind of dynamic. Like back to
Yeah.
your pre-modern modern, and I don't want to
Hmm.
draw those distinctions too much,
Sure.
but
Sure.
another way of understanding the self is that you are in a larger story and
Uh-huh.
you matter within it, but you don't matter within it. Like it's a
Hmm.
huge, huge eschatological story where I think
Hmm.
one of the really peculiarities of being modern is it's like like it's you, what you feel, what you're
Yeah.
doing. Like, like screw the whole world. There's no other
Yeah. Yeah.
larger story than the story of how I
Yes.
can feel happy with myself. And so
Wow.
why should I participate in a huge eschatological story if it doesn't make me happy?
Hmm.
And it
Hmm.
causes me
Hmm.
to have to sacrifice. And
Hmm.
that sacrifice doesn't, if that's not what I want, why should I participate in
Yeah.
that? And that's
Yeah.
essentially what, kind of what's going on here. Like Mark
Yeah.
Scout is giving information to Mark S to say, you can participate. You have a calling. You're being called into
Yeah.
a very, it's not a great job. Like you get
Right.
annihilated here, let's be honest.
Yeah.
But it brings down this system and it bursts a new reality potentially,
Wow.
and yeah, at the end of the day, it's like, but do I want that? What does that mean for me? Um,
Hmm.
which at some ways, is like legitimate. Like you have
Hmm.
it's your own existence to make sense of, but there is something about the way we constitute the self as like, again, this is my story. This is my feeling. It's not out there where I do think that the kind of inner space sense is like, there's a huge story going on here and you're playing a part in it and some people are called really deeply into it, like
Mm.
people like Moses or people like
Hmm.
in other religious traditions like Mohammed or something are like called deeply into participating in this larger story, but the rest of us are all parts. We all play parts in it, but not really.
Yeah.
For late moderns, not really.
Yeah.
It's me. Like,
Right.
am I happy or am I not,
Right. I absolutely love the eschatological language and like the idea of this apocalypse, like this unveiling that he's being called into. I had not used the term eschatology in my thinking about it. And one thing love about how the show handles this dilemma is I think one of the reasons it's so successful is because you can so deeply empathize with both Mark Scout and Mark
Yeah.
S. Like at least for me, I can really deeply
Yeah, oh,
empathize with both
absolutely.
sides of that coin. And I want to get to maybe in a few minutes, I want to get to just exploring the decision at the very end
Mm,
of the finale.
hmm.
But I want to before we get there, I want to touch on this theme of grief and despair that you just alluded to a minute ago.
Yeah.
Because in many ways, I read the show as kind of sparked by the despair of late modernity,
Hmm.
because the whole thing hinges like, and the I believe it's the very first scene is Mark Scout weeping in his car outside of Lumon,
Yeah.
or it's at least a very
Yeah.
very early scene, right? And you learn more about what he's grieving and the loss of, or what he thinks is the loss of his wife, and so I don't know what can you just comment a little bit on having talked about the self existing in a way it does in the pursuit of happiness in the Montaigne kind of style, how does despair figure into that? Because despair is the opposite of happiness, but why is it pressing in so
Yeah.
much on this kind of late modern experience that we're having?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So
There's a
it
lot
does
there.
seem there is a lot there, but yeah, yeah. And to start pulling the thread, and then you can make sure we don't fall
Sure.
off the edge
I'll
here.
do my best.
Um, that it does seem to me like I wonder what you think of this. I feel like the whole show so far has really been a parable in some sense about the opioid crisis.
Sure. I
In what I mean by that is like, that
can
Purdue
see that.
Big Pharma or whatever, like Lumen, we're not, I don't know, we're not even sure what Lumen is. Are
Yeah.
they a tech company? Are they a
Right.
pharma company? Like what are they essentially a religious cult? Yes.
Right.
Like, I
Right.
mean, that's interesting in itself, like the way
Yeah.
pharma and tech take on these kind of forms of ultimacy. And like when Google's trying to solve death, they're
Right. Oh
really
my
close
gosh.
to being, I don't know if I want to say a cult, but they're in the realm of the metaphysical,
Metaphysical and
really.
religious claims. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And like claims of ultimacy and things like that. So Lumen's that, but like what really triggered it for me is how Purdue Pharma, like essentially, well, they didn't essentially, they invented the pain scale and then
Mm,
kind of push their opioids that human beings should not feel pain, and that they're doing
mm,
this great service by making us not feel pain, and it becomes an utterly devastating crisis to human souls, but also to societies, like
mm,
across Appalachia and things like that. But there is
mm.
this sense that that if you can solve the problem of pain, what better thing could you do? And
Yeah.
yet I do like what I want to explore, and this is because, like Luther's theology of the cross is just the one drumbeat I keep going back to over
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
over again. But I think it's particularly important in this time because of what Severance is raising, which is that we do feel like our views of the self as this inward space as opposed to an interspace. And it really comes down to how do I feel about myself, and therefore, am I happy with myself and with my life and with the way myself is engaging in this world? Then pain, suffering, even negativity becomes utterly verboten. Like if it should be eliminated. There's nothing good within it. It is only bad. And if you could then therefore create a drug or create a microchip in the head that
Mhm.
could make all painful experiences have have no impact on your being, that then that would be an incredible thing. And yet I think particularly in the Christian tradition, but I think this is often true in Buddhism and others, is like actually the road into despair and suffering, it teaches you something, but more so in Christianity, at least, or at least this is the tradition I know best, is that something meets you there. Like one of the ways to make sure you find yourself in a profound encounter of interspace
Mm,
is to walk into your suffering, often not alone, but with a community of people who will gather around
mm,
experiences of brokenness and loss and hold you. In many ways, it's a way of you have to re-remember your
mm.
grief to
Yes.
have someone else help you re-remember or remember correctly, and what Mark S is choosing, and well, Mark S particularly, of the backstory of the people we know, is choosing to forget his grief, at least
Right.
for the business hours.
Mm,
Um, and at one level, you get that. Like, that makes so much sense and such a captivating story because
hmm.
who wouldn't? And Dylan
Yeah.
is just like trying to forget how much work sucks. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, if you could, like,
Yeah.
when you're in a
Yeah.
job that kind of sucks, if you could just like close your eyes and then wake up
Just
home and
wake
be
up
like,
on the other side.
yeah, you'd be like, oh, that was great. If I could, I wonder how the show was created. With someone like, what if I could just sleep through
Yeah.
work? You know what I
Was that
mean? Like, it was just
was that
like,
the germ of the idea? Yeah.
yeah, or
Yeah.
something. But yeah. I mean, I think particularly, well, what we do know from the what's revealed in the final episode is that Lumen is trying to solve the problem of pain,
Yes. Hmm.
and um, and that's fascinating. Like, it's
Hmm.
fascinating to think about when the self becomes our when the self becomes so central and happiness becomes our idol, then there is actually no productivity for pain and suffering.
Mm,
And grief is to be something utterly, um, well, it's not even to be something feared, because I think grief at some level we should fear it. I mean, it is an incredible shakeup to our lives, but it's something like to try to eliminate. That just seems really profound to me. Like, in
yeah.
Lumen's world, you can't have a crucified Christ. Like, that's too
Mm.
negative.
Say
Or
more
you
about
have
that.
well, I mean, like the negativity of the crucifixion
Yeah.
would maybe you could have it in some kind of mythological way, kind of a bit like the goat, like it becomes
Right. Right. Hmm.
a kind of sacrifice that allows the rest of us never to have to be unhappy or to experience pain. But yet,
Mm-hmm.
what I think what this breaks down theologically for me is that the primary way we participate in God's life, I think, is to experience God's ministerial act, like God coming to us and ministering life out of death, which does mean this move that we have to make confessions of our experiences of grief and loss
Loss.
and our
Mm-hmm.
need of someone else to be with us, to be for
Mm-hmm.
us, to be beside us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if you don't find yourself at limit, or you don't find yourself at a moment of brokenness, or you don't find yourself at a moment of loss, or in the vein of the book, to make another plug for the book,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
like this
Plug
French
away.
thinker, yeah, Jean Rousseau, like you have to say goodbye.
Mm.
That the Christian life's a pilgrim's life, which is also interesting because at Lumen there's no pilgrimage. There's no
Yeah, that's
pilgrimage
true.
towards anything really. I mean, in some sense, there is a pilgrimage once they start doing what they're not supposed to do, which is
Right.
they start going through the hallways, they start trying to figure out what's here, they walk into the goat room, like then
Mm-hmm.
they're on pilgrimage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
I
and
love
at
that.
and at that level, they have to kind of start. They have to be aimed towards something. So they have to
Mm-hmm.
be. This is Rousseau's kind of perspective. You have to be diem towards God.
Mm.
But I guess in France and in the 14th century, to diem to God was also an idiom for goodbye. So you would say,
Mm.
like, like when we end our YouTube here, we'd say, "See you later, Joel. Adieu to God.
Yeah.
Go to God this day." But
Mm-hmm.
that means like goodbye. I'm leaving. And so the
Mm.
pilgrim always had to say adieu because they were aimed towards God as they walked, but they were also having to say goodbye. They
Mm.
often gave a will and testament. They were walking into suffering. I mean, into pain. The
Mm.
pilgrimage was a choice into pain, and that's what our four people do in the series actually is once they leave the
Yeah.
consoles, they do walk into pain
Mm-hmm.
at a certain level. Like they walk into suffering, even at the level of just knowing.
Yeah.
Um, to know is to suffer something,
Yes.
is
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and and this takes us back to history too. Like there's no way not to be struck with pain of just the history of time. Watching your
Mm.
parents age, watching
Yeah.
your kids grow. Like
Mm-hmm.
those are painful and there's grief in that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet that's where all the beauty rests too, and all the
Yeah.
transformation rests. And I mean, selves that had no experiences or events of pain would be incredibly flat and
Yep.
dull. And
Yes. Yeah.
so there's a certain way in modernity and late modernity, and a kind of capitalist late modernity, that where we would choose to be flat, happy selves than selves with depth
Wow.
and yeah, in texture, because we're afraid of the dark. And
Yeah.
I say this as someone who's a bit afraid of the dark. Like I'm
Sure. Me too.
absolutely frightened of loss and grief. And I think my whole life is kind of
Mm-hmm.
like had experiences of grief very young, and have been kind of running my whole life away from it, or
Mm.
maybe running into the theology of the cross because I'm so frightened
Mm.
of what's there, but also have experienced a presence that's there,
Yeah.
that heals. And
Wow.
yeah, so that's the question. Like in some sense, what Lumen, there's no wonder they have this mythology of being a cult or a religion, because to try to eliminate pain in some ways is to try to end the Judeo-Christian God.
Wow.
Is try to eliminate that. I think. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, that's striking. So many, man, so many things to pick up there, but some thoughts that were going through my mind as you were talking there is, first of all, the point about community, like the innies build, you could almost call
Yeah,
them a church. They build a community based on
yeah.
their shared pilgrimage experience they're having,
And
and
that's a
also,
problem. And that's a
yes,
problem
mm-hmm,
for them. Like that's kind of why they want to keep them at just like waffles, and like all
exactly,
that stuff seems terrible because
yeah,
community is a dangerous thing
yes.
for the larger oppressive structure.
For
Sorry, I didn't.
Lumen, and no, 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 that's
Yeah.
good because what I was going to say is you get the sense of how dangerous it is because Lumen tries to then twist and instrumentalize and when the season 2 comes back and then you find they make them watch that instructional video that
Yeah. Yeah.
Keanu Reeves voiced, or the voice for, and it's like Lumen's trying to kind of instrumentalize this rebellion as like such a good thing for Lumen, and it's purely manipulative tactics, obviously, but that
Yeah.
points to how dangerous the community is. To them, which I think is super
Hmm.
interesting. And also another thought that was going through my mind as you were talking about grief there is I don't know we don't know totally what the show is trying to say yet in terms of kind of the ultimate arc, but
Yeah.
it's super interesting to me that the story is communicating that grief is inescapable, even if you
Hmm.
carve out a part of your brain that's just going to live in this building for 8 hours a
Yeah.
day, then that part of your brain is going to encounter grief, so there's
Yeah.
something about the inescapability of it, even despite all our attempts, and modernity, and you've done a lot
Hmm.
more reading on modernity than I have, but like it seems to me that one of the most perceptive thinkers on modernity are bring out this point that like one of the dangers that we have, or the malaise we experience in Taylor's verbiage, is we have so many things we can pull, so many levers we can pull to try to numb out, like we have
Yeah.
access to so much of that stuff, which is creates a really dangerous soul level sickness for us, I think. And that I
Hmm.
just find really compelling, that it's really interesting to me that the show is I think it's trying to say things about that, like to be a
Yeah.
person, to be a self, is to encounter grief, and there's no escape pod.
Hmm.
Even though it's interesting, 3 of the 4 tempers are
Yeah.
arguably negative. Like, what are they? They're dread, malice, woe, which are all, we would
Yeah.
want those things, and then frolic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyways, I don't know. Does that spark
Yeah.
any other further thoughts?
Yeah, well, frolic could have its negativity too. You know what I
True.
mean?
Yeah.
Like it,
Yeah.
especially outside of kind of the Protestant work ethic. Like frolic is like, well,
Yeah. What's the point?
what's the point of this?
Yeah.
And frolicking
Yes.
has a kind of an overtone of like kind of sexual
Yeah, that's true.
laissez-faire kind of
Yeah.
thing to it.
Yeah.
Kind of Freudian kind of sense of
Hmm.
frolicking.
Hmm.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I think that really is the point is that once. Yeah, that's what's so dangerous about them doing anything other than the data entry,
Hmm.
and why. I mean, it's very Lost-esque with
Yeah.
the kind of like part of the thing that find like, I mean, this is interesting in itself. Like, what's so haunting about the show or about Lumen is it's like, is this past or future? Like,
Yes.
like
Yes.
is the technology we're really advanced, but actually we're not. They were like watching
Yeah.
things on like VCRs or whatever. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like, there's there's something like lost in that. Where it's
Totally.
like you're not sure where in time you are and what's occurred here. But if they just do data entry, then and they're doing this for like what like the little the little finger thing and like they're all
Oh
these
yeah.
like like the
Forgot about that.
rewards are
Yeah.
like so
Ridiculous. Yeah.
ridiculously
Yeah.
pointless. But
Hmm.
part of that is that if they're too big, if these people have too many conversations, if they
Hmm.
do form a community and God forbid, like, they fall in love, like Mark asks,
Right.
and Helly happens, then your point, I think, is exactly right. Like, there's inevitable pain. Like,
Yes.
if you're bound to another, in some way, even, yeah, I mean, in some ways that moves beyond weak tie. You move to
Hmm.
some kind of strong tie.
Hmm.
And then maybe that doesn't mean romantic love or something, but some kind of strong tie. Then all of a sudden, well, what we see with Dylan is that Dylan, both twice at the end of both seasons, in many ways, chooses to sacrifice himself for the others. Like
Yeah.
he keeps the thing open at the end of season one, so they can have an experience, and he doesn't have it. And then that interaction with his own Audi,
Yeah. Which,
where
so
yeah,
heartbreaking. Like, yeah.
yeah, yeah, but in some sense, like both of them kind of make a sacrifice.
Hmm.
I don't know. I mean, I don't quite have my head around that, but um, yeah, but that causes a form of suffering. There's a
Hmm.
kind of there's a beautiful suffering in both of those
Yes.
moments for Dylan at the end of season one and season two. And once you care about people, you'll have to suffer. And that becomes the issue. And
Hmm.
I don't know. I mean, it is another really phenomenal thing is that to have this be about the grief of a lost spouse. Because I don't know your experience, but like being a young adult and getting married, and you realize like, oh shit, like what have I done to myself?
Yeah.
In my life, in a sense, like, and I
Yes.
think we often think of that as like a comic move, like now you can't just play PlayStation all day or
Right. Right.
whatever,
Right. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I remember feeling like this overwhelmed sense, like she leaves, goes to the grocery store, some idiot
Hmm.
runs a red light
Hmm.
and T-bones her and kills her. How
Hmm.
do I recover from this?
Yes.
Like I've wrapped my life around this person
Yeah.
in a pretty significant way, and now yeah, I mean, Car and I have been thinking of this as we've turned 50 now. Like, this ends. This
Hmm.
ends. Like at some point we will have to say goodbye to each other,
Mm,
like hopefully not for another 30, 35 years, but it's
yeah,
it's it's going to happen. So as
yeah.
soon as in one friendship or romantic love,
Hmm.
to wrap your lives together in that way means you have to say goodbye, and that is
Yeah,
painful.
yeah.
But that's also beautiful,
Hmm.
and so but also painful,
Yes,
so
yes, yes.
if the point is to be contented on your chateau,
Yeah.
it's interesting because Montaigne he lost his daughters that he loved. Like he had to
Mm,
bury many of them, and he's inspired into writing the essays because his friend La Botte dies, like his great friend. He would have never written the essay. They just had these conversations. So he dies, and so he decides to write essays to keep this conversation with his friend going. And so, I mean, it's a kind of also a way we've violated Montaigne's legacy by becoming so hell-bent on the pursuit of happiness that we've decided, well, if we could create a chip or a drug that would keep us from ever feeling sad, then we would
yeah.
be okay. But again, in the book, I try to make this assertion like following Jesus into sadness is where you actually find
Hmm.
transformation,
Hmm.
where you find a kind of sacramental reality where opposites are turned into new possibilities.
Yeah. And I loved your on that point. I loved your unpacking of Pascal's wager in that direction. I
Mm,
thought that was one of the parts of the book that really landed with me. Um, well, let me ask you some specific questions about Severance, and then you fire
okay.
away. So, do you think Burt's innie is going to heaven?
Yeah, that is fascinating, right?
I thought that was such a weird and interesting scene. This is the dinner scene between Burt and
Yeah,
Irving and Burt's husband. I can't remember his name off the top of my head.
yeah.
The
It was
character's
a
name.
Lutheran pastor too, I think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They were Lutheran. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
mentioned that they go to this Lutheran church. Yeah, which is
Right, right,
interesting.
right, right. So the Lutheran pastor says that they go, yeah, that innies go to heaven, right? Or they could.
Well,
It
yeah,
is,
the idea,
yeah,
if I'm remembering it right, the idea
yeah,
was, and this is a little bit of a silly question, but the
yeah. No,
idea that
it's
the Burt unpacks in the dinner that like he says something like, I've done so many bad things, there's no chance of me going to heaven, which isn't itself is that's it, we could set aside
yeah,
the theology of that or whatever, but
yeah,
so the idea of him carving off an innie was that his innie might have a chance at redemption, essentially is what
yeah.
how I understood it. So yeah.
And didn't we kind of get a sense too that maybe what he was like one of the heavies for Lumen and like made people disappear,
It
And so
seems
then
that way. It's
that's kind
still
of how it seemed to
mysterious.
me. Yeah, like
There's
that big
something
dude.
sinister going on for sure.
Hmm. That big dude that Mark Scout takes by the gun, and then
Yeah.
Mark S accidentally
Yeah,
shoots in the
right.
neck. I kind of got the feeling that Christopher Walken's character Burt was like
Something like
one of
that.
those guys, and
Yeah.
like made people disappear.
Hmm.
Um, I think what's fascinating about it is like this is a question, I think, of consciousness, and
Hmm.
like, oh yeah, like what is redeemed here? And I think it's overall a really interesting question. Like there's so much here through the show that I think highlights a lot of like Taylor perspectives or the philosophical
Hmm.
perspectives of that. The one thing that I think that would be kind of a pushback is that like Taylor is really impacted by Merleau-Ponty, who was
Hmm.
this kind of phenomenologist and really wanted to write about how all we know is embodied, like your body. And so Taylor writes his dissertation being like, whatever consciousness is, it is not, we are not just brains and fats. Like our
Hmm.
bodies are so significant. So I don't know the answer to how I would respond right now, other than to say, particularly within the Christian tradition, the body really matters.
Yeah.
So um, if
And
we
there's
could
this
get this,
interesting,
yeah,
oh, I was just gonna say, there's this
yeah,
interesting tension in the show where there's these lines where when the scientists are observing, the doctors are observing the experiments, like what, like in the end when Gemma and Mark are in the same room, and they use the line, "The barrier is holding," I think is what they say.
yes,
So
yes,
that is, I think, getting to the core of a lot of what the show is trying to explore about the notion of self and embodiment, actually, because it's like
yeah, yeah,
these two bodies are in the same room and their minds have been partitioned off, and in their view, it's a success that they've managed to keep the the mind's
Right.
separate while the bodies are together. I just think there's something really interesting
Yeah,
going
there
on there
is.
too.
Yeah. So it is a question of like what is redeemed?
Hmm.
Is it consciousness
Hmm.
or is it bodies? You know, like is
Right.
there something in is it possible to disconnect those two things? You know, like I don't
Yeah.
know. Yeah, so it raises that for me. So
Yeah, that's
um
interesting.
yeah, I don't know if Burt goes to heaven or not. I don't know. We'll have
his
to wait to
his
season 3 to
Yeah,
see.
that yeah, I'm
Yeah.
sure that'll be a scene in, either
Yeah.
the pearly gates or but
Yeah.
um another question, and then I want to spend just 5 minutes theorizing about where we think the
Okay.
show is going to go, because I think that'd be really fun. But one other question is on, and I alluded to this earlier, but in the finale, the last shot, which is such an awesome shot, is of Marcus and Helly running down the hall,
Yeah.
with Gemma pounding on the door. Uh, my question for you: did any Mark make the right call?
Mm.
Go wherever you
Um,
want with that.
yeah, I mean, I found it a bit tragic, I guess.
Hmm.
And I right now what I want to say, and I may rethink, I may come down in a different opinion,
It's kind of
but
not a fair question because we don't know how it's going to go, but
well, yeah.
but in
And
the
I may
moment,
yeah, even with what all we know, I may change my mind, but I think he made a decision that was very much a decision inside of our zeitgeist. He made the right decision
oh,
for our zeitgeist, which
that's
is that
interesting.
you choose love.
Hmm.
You choose you choose this journey. In some ways, like what happens, what's fascinating about that final scene is the music is playing, they're running, you know, and they're not on pilgrimage anymore. They're
Nope.
not trying to discover what's hidden. They're running to some ecstasy of encounter. I don't know.
Yeah.
We don't even really know what they're
Where are they
running
gonna
to,
go?
right?
Yeah.
They're just together. They're just,
Yeah.
you know, I'm in Hawaii right now. They're just romantically running on the beach. Like there's all these
Hmm.
people right now here that are in this kind of illusion of being in the island
Mm.
and this moment of romance, or they're trying to reignite their marriages or their
You're right.
relationships, or they're trying to, kick them off on the right way. They're essentially running through that. If he was to turn and go through that door and go back to Gemma, he he is it in some sense it's a Lazarus story in
Hmm.
that like it's resurrection of their love, but they will have to say goodbye to each other again.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it feels like with Helly, it is eternal in a certain kind of delusional consumer way, maybe.
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like it's
Yeah.
ecstatic in a certain kind of sense where what happens if he goes through the door? He goes home with Gemma, they go back to their house. They are just so happy and so thankful to be together, but eventually they're still annoyed with each other. They have all this
Right.
history of like what why the hell can't you put your coffee cup
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
the dishwasher? Like all the things of life come
Hmm.
back. But that's also what is beautiful. And
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
like I mean, I think we're set up as viewers to want him to go with Helly. You know, like
Hmm. Hmm.
Helly is that actress plays her perfectly.
So good.
She's
Hmm.
so Innie Helly is just so you want to hang out with her. You know, like
Hmm.
she gives him that hug right at the beginning of the episode. And you're like, I could use a hug like
Yeah.
that. Like she just seems like she gives a good
Yeah.
hug. You know,
Yeah. Well,
um,
and even her is it her father or her grandfather? I think it's her father, James, the
yeah,
really creepy,
yeah,
clearly off guy. He even says, he basically says, I like you better than your Audi. Like I
yeah,
like
yeah.
like yeah, so there's a strong, I think the show's
Well,
trying to play
he
that up.
actually says he sees it. I mean, if we put this in like Christian language, he sees the image of God in her and not in her other kids.
Yeah.
He
Wow.
sees
Yeah.
cure. He says,
Hmm.
I looked for
That's
cure
right.
in these people, and I have not seen cure, but I see cure in you."
Yeah.
And she's
Yeah.
like, "You're a great dad," in
Yeah.
that like sarcastic way. So yeah, so right now I feel like um, the choice was made in a very yeah. I think the
That's
choice,
a great answer.
ironically, I think the choice most viewers want Mark S to make, he made. At
Hmm.
another level, he made a choice for the events that make him. And the event that makes him is, I mean, if you want to read this as interspace, he
Mm.
made the choice for the interspace. He only knows himself by being with Helly. Like that's how he's come to know himself in the like his own sense of self is as one who loves Helly. So he would
Mm.
really be choosing a kind of annihilation.
Self-destruction. Yeah.
Yeah. But the question becomes, I think, for us is like in a moral vision, it's like
Yeah.
if you don't have a larger story, like an eschatological story, a story of apocalypse, that you're living out of, then he does make the right
Yeah.
choice. If the objective here is to bring down Lumen,
Right.
well, um, now we're not sure that that can happen. Like
Yeah.
Lumen was going to be brought down if he walked through that door for the most
Yeah.
part.
Right. Right.
I mean,
Right.
obviously the show, I mean, I guess this is your segue into what happens
Yeah.
next. I
This is
think
a good segue, actually.
we're going to find a way for that inside their love and inside that running is, a way to take down Lumen because we do
Yeah.
know in this beautiful way that Helly is hell bent on bringing Lumen down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and it's fascinating, just back a bit where she says in that scene where he says, "I see cure in you." She says, "You've created hell. You and your
I forgot
family
about that.
have
Yeah.
created hell." That's fascinating because we usually think of hell as an eternal place of torture.
Yeah. Right.
And what if
Right.
what if hell is actually a eternal place of mall-like happiness?
Yeah.
Just a kind of
Yeah.
dull
Yeah.
music kind of
Yes.
happiness, but there's no pain because there's no boundness, there's no beauty, there's no sense of encounter, there's no dialogue. Like
Yep.
it's just a mall where no one really pays attention to you and the food just is okay and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
instead of like being eternally, tortured
Wow.
by demons forever in
Right.
pain, maybe
Right.
what hell is. I mean, this is kind of very much C.S. Lewis's
I was
kind
just
of
thinking of the Great
sense. Yeah.
Divorce, the Gray Town. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
it's just a kind of it's just a place to be kind of blasé happy,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
always be a little bit haunted by overwhelming depression. But you're
Yeah.
just like you're just above
Oh
the
man.
line here of just being able to stay just happy enough,
Uh,
never having a deep encounter and experience. And
oh man. That is
so
chilling.
in many ways, like Lumen is trying to bring hell,
Yeah.
and so Mark S, if he would have went through that door, could have participated in the eschatological move of taking down hell, but
Wow.
he chose the emotive and yeah, the
So
romantic. I don't know.
yeah, I love that answer about that he made the right choice for the time the zeitgeist, I think is what he said.
Yeah.
That is so well encapsulated. So what do you think in our last 5 minutes? The showrunners have indicated there is a finite arc. They kind of know where things are
Okay.
going. Right now, I'm living in a lot of fear and trembling that they're going to stretch it out too long because it's been
I
successful.
know.
I really hope they don't do that.
And it happened with Lost. It happened with
Exactly.
Lost.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It happens with so many things. But what you just theorize, totally theorize for a minute. Where do you think the show is going to go? Do you have any thoughts about what they're ultimately going to try to say, or how things are gonna, how that arc is going to land? Any guesses?
Well, this is what I loved about the show. I have no idea,
Yeah,
like no
sure.
idea, and that's how I felt after season one too. Like I have no idea what season two is going to be. Like what's going to
Right.
happen here?
Yeah.
Other
Yeah.
than we knew that Gemma was alive, but how is that going to unfold? And so it really is a question of what are they running towards? What are they going to do?
Hmm.
They're still caught on that floor.
Yeah.
So now basically Gemma's out.
They're
What
living in the
happens?
imminent frame of that Lumen building.
Yeah,
That is
yeah,
their.
yeah, yeah. Right. And
So
so I don't know. Yeah. What do you think?
I have one specific thought.
Okay.
That I don't know where they're gonna the whole thing's gonna land. I do think Mark Scout and Jim are gonna be reunited. I think that's where things are going.
You do.
I do, yeah.
See, I
And
find that hard because there's the connection between Mark S, the innies, Innie
and
Helly and Innie
Hallie.
Mark, is so deep that
Hmm.
it's hard for I think most viewers would feel like, no,
Yeah,
I don't know.
I
But you think they're going to
I
be
have a
reunited.
thought.
Okay.
Well, I have a thought that kind of is the reason I think that, which is I
Okay.
wonder, and I'm getting way on a limb here. I could be completely wrong, but I think that we're going to learn some really distressing and disturbing revelations about Lumen's manipulations of Mark and Gemma that go farther back. And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
wonder if Lumen is the reason they couldn't have a child. Like, I wonder if there
Oh,
was some
interesting.
intervention. There's one small detail, and I could be making way too
Hmm.
much out of this, but we live in the age of Reddit and internet theories, so I'm just
Yeah.
riding the tide. But there's a small detail that's super easy to miss where in one of the flashback scenes where Mark and Jim are giving blood, I think it's actually how they meet. And the
Oh, yeah.
lumen, the material is it's lumen manufactured equipment that they're giving blood on. So I just wonder if there's going to be, and the fact that I also am connecting the fact that Gemma had to deconstruct a crib in the last room, which was supposed to
Yeah,
be the ultimate test of, the barriers
right.
holding psychologically. So I just wonder if they're going to learn something about Lumen has managed Mark and Gemma's relationship to such an extent that it actually caused the
Right.
grief that then drove Mark into the doors of the building. And we obviously know that they were controlling that whole situation. And so I wonder if those
Yeah.
revelations are going to actually cause some sort of shift. And then Mark S is going to decide to bring Lumen down out of that. And then there's going to
Yeah.
be, I don't know. Those are some of my
Yeah,
hot takes
no,
for you.
that
But
makes really good sense. That makes, yeah. There, we have to find out more backstory on how Lumen,
mhm,
yeah, how Lumen gets their claws into Marquez and
right.
Gemma.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot going on there.
And what's going to happen with all the other partitions that have been created in Gemma's mind, like
Yep.
all of the
Right.
consciousnesses that Mark
She's got
S actually
25 of them, right?
that he
Yeah.
built. Yeah, that's what he was doing that whole time, was
Right.
building them.
And it's clear from what was supposed to happen next that she is not to live. Like
Right.
she was going to be killed. Like
Yes.
that you cannot live with 25 consciousnesses in
Right.
you.
Right.
Is that the plural? That
Yeah.
like
Hmm.
you can't do that. So now what's going to happen that she's loose in the world with
Hmm.
these and
Hmm.
can Lumen access them in some ways? Can they flip a
Can they
switch?
flip them
And
on? Yeah. Oof.
yeah. Yeah,
Wow.
like,
It's gonna be a
uh,
wild ride, I'm sure.
yeah.
I hope that the show stays as quality as it's been. But all
Yeah.
right, I'll let you get to snorkeling and whatever frolic you're going to experience in Hawaii.
This is Innie Andy in
Yeah.
Hawaii,
That's
seeking the
fantastic.
self to be just happy, the land of happiness.
That's
Yeah.
so great. Well, as always, thanks for your work. I really did love this book. I try to make that super clear in my review. I think I
Thank
know
you.
it's not technically part of the Ministry in the Secular Age series, but it's very much feels in the vein of it for me.
It is.
I
Yeah,
hope you keep.
it pretty much is.
It's great. I love it. I hope you keep exploring these ideas. You're one of my favorite writers on kind of culture,
Mhm.
our cultural landscape. So yeah, I just whatever you put out, I'll be excited to talk about it. So thank you.
Well, I'm honored, Joel. Thanks for having me. It's really fun to talk about the show.